Congressman John Garamendi, thank you so much for being here with us today, talking about a really important topic in Iran, and a member of the Armed Services Committee as well. So we're glad to have you here talking about this. Let's just start with your analysis of the likelihood that we end up in an armed conflict with Iran.
We came very, very close to stumbling into one. The president has set out his maximum pressure against Iran when he pulled out of the JCPOA. That was the nuclear deal with Iran. Pulled out of that and then applied maximum pressure. Needless to say, Iran pushed back. Shooting down that drone came very, very close. Fortunately, the president pulled back. He was ready to launch a kinetic, that's things that go boom.
Yeah.
Pulling back gives us all time to do the appropriate response.
Yeah, I think no matter where you stand politically, you got to concede that was a pretty measured response, right?
Well, pulling back was certainly the right thing to do for two reasons. One, we didn't, or he didn't, have an opportunity to consider the second level effect. Iran strikes us, we strike Iran, then what? So you want to be careful about that. Second, hadn't lined up the allies. And most important of all, that's a retaliatory action. That's not a defensive action. That retaliatory action requires congressional approval. Only Congress can declare war. That strike would have been an act of war. So fortunately, we're now in a situation where we have time. We need to respond. We need to respond in the appropriate way, so there's a very clear message. But we need to be very measured and understand exactly what might happen.
So the president did say that part of the reason he pulled back, he almost greenlit this attack, but he pulled back because the casualty number, he said, wouldn't have been proportional to their shooting a drone down over their waters. What would be a proportional response?
Well, this is something that has to be worked out with the military. And as I say, whatever our retaliation is, we must think about what Iran would then do. And it may very well be that a proportion is not a military strike at all. It may be some other effort, perhaps a sanction, perhaps dealing with Iran's economy, their banking systems, other things that can be done that might be far more harmful to Iran than a military strike.
You know, we talk about credibility of this administration right now and its response. We are hearing two different things. We're hearing from Iranian intelligence that this drone is flying over Iranian territory. We're hearing from the United States and from our intelligence that we were over international waters. Does it concern you at all that, number one, we even have these credibility issues at all? And do you accept our assessment that our drone was flying properly over international waters?
I don't. Yes, I accept our assessment. We know exactly where these planes are, and we know that they are either in or out of international waters. In this case, we know that they were in. However, we also know that from time to time, our ships do go into Iranian territory. We had one our naval ships actually taken over by Iran because it was in their space.
I want to ask you, Congressman, though, the fact that we have these credibility questions at all, how much of a concern is that?
Of course it's a concern. Keep in mind the map of this particular area. The international waters at the point of the Strait of Hormuz is probably no more than a couple of miles. You've got Oman on one side, you have Iran on the other side. So it's very easy to get off course. We were in international water, there's no doubt about that. Now it's possible that Iran, less sophisticated, may very well have come up that they had done right. Bottom line of this is they shot down our very valuable asset. There has to be a response, has to be measured. Doesn't have to be a military response. That's why we have time now. As soon as this happened, I said, well, on national television, take a deep breath. Take a deep breath, let's figure this one out. And by the way, get our allies with us.
Yeah.
Don't act alone. Bring the rest of the world. Let's work together.
You brought up our European allies.
Yes.
And we're in a tough spot with them because it seems like, according to the JCPOA, the Iran agreement, Iran would have been allowed to only carry 660 pounds of enriched uranium.
Exactly.
Right? We pulled back on that agreement, so the Iranian government has said this week they're going to pass that number. Our European allies are still in the agreement with Iran, right? That puts us in a really tough spot with respect to trying to enforce. Do we take enforcement measures with Iran if they do that? Because technically they're still violating the agreement, although we backed out of it.
Well, this is where this thing has really gone very, very difficult. Obama negotiated together with the European allies, NATO, Germany, United Kingdom and France and China and Russia, this joint JCPOA. It's in place. United States pulls out and imposes sanctions on Iran. The rest of the world didn't. And so we've got a very difficult situation in which the United States is acting alone. Iran, as I said, is trying to push back. The United States is applying maximum pressure. So is Iran. That's created the crisis at hand. And Iran has taken one more step, and that is to move towards this enriched uranium, increasing it. Now, what are we going to do about it? Our allies are not with us. And this was the mistake that I believe the president made by pulling out alone.
Yeah. You know, they do have real politics in their country.
Yes.
You know, the moderates are there in Iran, but their hardliners are really in control at this point. And I don't think you can classify these attacks this past week as anything other than really aggressive and statements toward the United States. Do we maybe need to get tougher, and do we need to seriously consider some action that's more than rhetoric and more than maybe a measured response?
Sure, we ought to consider it. And when we do consider it, consider exactly where we are and what they are. They are a major political power. They're no small time. They'll make Iraq look like a part-time player.
Yeah.
Also, they have allies in the area. They have the Houthis in Yemen. They have Hezbollah. And they have forces in Syria and forces in Iraq. So if we take action, it's entirely probable. And we must plan that all of those surrogates will also get involved. And now we may have a major conflagration in that area. We've been there already. Iraq 1, Iraq 2, and ISIS. Be very, very careful here. Be very measured. Take your time, understand, and for heaven's sakes, do two things. One, make sure you have the Congress with you. And secondly, make sure you have your allies.
John Bolton's on the record as saying that he's for regime change in Iran. If that is the strategy coming from the White House, you're on the Armed Services Committee. Yep. How privy are you to that? How much are they communicating with you in terms of what our long-term strategy is in Iran?
There's no classification about where John Bolton is. For the last 20 years, he has been for regime change. He was for bombing. He was for attacking Iran, doing whatever's necessary to force a regime change. The maximum pressure strategy that the president has employed for the last year, 14, 15 months, is clearly a Bolton strategy. Is it going to work? Well, it certainly created tension, created a crisis. Can we get through this crisis? We must. But I think we also need to be very, very measured. And I think Bolton is wrong. Clearly, the hardliners in Iran have been emboldened by what has happened thus far since the United States pulled out of the JCPOA.
How in the loop, though, are you, again, as a member of the Armed Services Committee? Is anybody from the White House, are there any liaisons coming to you guys in Congress, certain committees, and saying, this is what we want to do, this is our long-term strategy, this is how we're going to respond to option A if, you know, option B doesn't happen?
You're halfway there. With regard to the long-term strategy that the current administration has, yes, they have clearly told us what that is. Anybody can go online, check out the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. He has 12 demands. The maximum pressure is to achieve those 12 demands. You take a look at them, you go, what are the odds of this happening? I would say slim to none.
So you don't agree with the policy coming from the White House, the strategy?
I do not. The United States, the president made a serious mistake, in my view, by pulling out of the joint agreement, the JCPOA. That isolated the United States with regard to our allies in Europe, China, and Russia, all of whom were in the game to stop the nuclearization program in Iran. The United States pulls out. Now we have a very serious crisis at hand. We didn't need to be here. That nuclear program was actually working. Everybody said it was working. Now we have a situation where it is not working. Iran is increasing its production of enriched uranium. And we now have this back and forth crisis. Didn't have to happen. Could we have achieved additional goals with Iran? Well, I believe we could. That's blowing in the wind, don't know. But I do know that Iran was not moving towards a nuclear weapon. And keep in mind that Iran was working with elements that were fighting ISIS. Not side by side with us, but a lot of the military militia that supported the fight against ISIS came from Iran.
Yeah, it's geopolitics, very complicated
It's very
in
complex.
that region. I just have one more question for you, and that is, let's hypothetically say this week we see another aggressive step from Iran. What does a proportional response from the United States look like at that point?
First and foremost, we have the right to defend ourselves. So if Iran is attacking any of our assets, we have the right to defend. So if we have a ship or an aircraft and they attack that aircraft, we have the right to take the aircraft battery out to defend ourselves. Now, what has happened in the current situation is the drone was attacked, it was downed, time went by, we're not defending, we're retaliating. That retaliation requires the president to come to Congress.
Okay.